Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss Sunak's comments about his attempts to control inflation and take a look at a few basics of what inflation is and how he is talking absolute nonsense. Far from controlling inflation, the Prime Minister has deliberately put in place policies to stoke inflation. Government policy is making inflation much worse than it needs to be, and he's using his own destructive policies as an excuse to keep public sector workers in poverty, and there's a reason for doing that as well. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So this would normally be the slot where I would be discussing Prime Minister's questions, but Parliament's on Christmas recess now. But Sunak did face questions yesterday from the Cross-Party Liaison Committee, whose role it is to scrutinise the work of the Prime Minister. It was Sunak's first liaison committee as Prime Minister, and during the exchanges, Sunak suggested that he would not budge on pay awards, including for nurses, where his government is currently losing the argument with the public. The reason he gave was the same reason the government have been giving for months, because it would further fuel inflation. Only this is nonsense. As various economists have pointed out, including some who have worked on Bank of England policy committees, public sector pay never fuels inflation. Like, by definition, just mathematically, the only thing that can fuel inflation is a cost which is above the current level of inflation. And even then, it has to be on a fairly large scale. But public sector workers have been getting below inflation pay rises. And all they're really asking for is an on-inflation pay rise. And they've been getting these real terms pay cuts for over a decade now. If you want to know where you stand in terms of income, the Bank of England inflation calculator is an excellent tool. But you put in what you were paid in, say, 2010, let it work out what your income should be now, if it kept pace with inflation. Is it that now? If you're in the public sector, probably not. Because unless it's significantly more than that, your pay has not been inflationary. So who should we look at? Well, we could look at those on the lowest wages first, legally anyway, those on minimum wage. Boris Johnson recently boasted earlier this year that his government boosted minimum wage by the highest rate ever. Oh, we're really generous. Well, let's see, shall we? Labour introduced the minimum wage in 1998. At the time, for those aged 22 and over, it was £3.60 an hour. By the end of Labour's time, it was £5.80. That was 32.4% above the rate of inflation in the intervening years between minimum wage being introduced and the last time that the Labour government got to set the new one. So not only did Labour introduce the policy, but they made sure that it rapidly increased during their time in office. As things currently stand, the Conservatives have also raised the minimum wage above the rate of inflation. They could hardly not, because the sheer number of people that would be in poverty would be politically too hot for even them to handle. But it's only gone above inflation to the tune of 11.9%. So Johnson's boost only accounts for a bit over a third of what Labour managed. So hardly the greatest historically. And both of them had a serious recession to deal with. It's not like the Tories get to say, oh yeah, but we've got this recession. Yeah, Labour had a recession. Do you remember how the Tories blamed Labour for it? So the Tories don't get to hide behind that. Now let's look at how the Tories have treated public sector workers. So let's take nurses, quite topical at the moment, along with anyone else on the NHS Band 5 scale. So at the entry level, and these are the ones that have actually done better than most, at the entry level, they were paid £21,176 a year. When the Tories came to power, that was the last time that Labour got to change that. So that means they should be on £30,002 a year now. However, they're actually on £27,055. So that's a pay cut of £2,947 for the bottom end of that scale. It's much more for the top end. But it's actually more than that. It's not just that they've cost nurses £3,000. They've cost nurses £3,000 this year. That is the difference between what they should be paid if it kept lining with inflation and now. But nurses have been taking real terms pay cuts for years. It didn't just start this year. It's been going on for years. So the total amount lost is way more because every year they've taken a real terms pay cut. So you add that up over 12 years, it amounts to a lot of money that the government have basically stolen from nurses and indeed other public sector workers. Sunak's trying to claim that paying public sector workers in line with inflation would fuel further inflation and harm the economy. No, Prime Minister, it's not public sector workers who are harming the economy. It's an inflation-linked pay rise, even for every worker in the country, can never be inflationary. That is just a mathematical fact. The only increase of anything that can be inflationary is something above the level of inflation. And we know what has driven our high inflation because the Bank of England and other economists have been quite clear. The doubling of the price of energy is a massive factor. I already talked about this week. You know, can't be helped, the government say, oh really? So how come other countries could help it? How come France has got half of our energy costs? Didn't used to be pretty much in line. Used to be almost the same. Now France, half the energy costs. When the government made the deliberate decision, it was their decision to double our energy prices, instead of freezing them in place, they made the decision to massively increase inflation. Because that is the largest factor in inflation right now. We know that the cost of energy is cited as the single greatest factor in our inflation right now. The government could have taxed windfall profits, used that to compensate energy companies for the increase in wholesale cost of energy. That would have kept the cost down, and as a result, kept inflation down by several percent. We know that the increased costs of food and other imports is a big driver of inflation. The weakening of the pound and Brexit trade barriers have seen to that. The government are responsible for not only Brexit, but the hard Brexit nature of our exit from the EU. They are responsible for the huge trade barriers which have increased the cost of trading in essential goods. They are responsible for the weakening of the pound, which means those goods cost even more due to the currency exchange. The severe shortage of labour, I'm going to be coming on to that again tomorrow. The severe shortage of labour is cited as a major barrier to growth. Remember, inflation is only half the story. As long as your economy grows to at least match inflation, there's no need for inflation to be an issue at all. So the government forcing us out of a huge labour market, doing nothing to compensate, is making inflation worse because we have lower growth. You know, people are going mad at 11% inflation. But in theory, if we had 11% growth, it wouldn't be an issue. Mind you, 11% sustained growth isn't realistic. So it is right to be concerned about double-digit inflation figures. But the point is that your real inflation is inflation minus growth. This is why our inflation is really so bad. Some gammons just try and compare inflation of various countries and go, oh, it's high in other countries as well. You know, even though, yeah, it's still higher here though, isn't it? But they ignore the fact that our growth is also worse. So if you actually showed inflation minus growth, that is way worse for the UK. I could also point out interest rate rises. This is increasing the cost of mortgages and as a result rents. Well, that's fueling inflation as well. Now, technically, it's the central bank that makes this decision, but they react to government policy. I will also say, though, that central banks across the Western world are doing the same, to the dismay of independent economists. So it's not a particularly British problem. You know, central banks across the world, Europe, North America, are also fueling inflation with high interest rates. But rising interest rates is also fueling inflation, and it is also as a result, as a reaction to government policy. You know, those are the reasons why inflation is such an issue. Not because workers are asking to avoid yet another real terms pay cut, which they've already been enduring for over a decade. So why are the government pretending that paying an at-inflation pay award would be inflationary, when mathematically it can't? Because they want public sector workers to be poor. They want public sector workers to be unable to afford the cost of living. To be broken down at the fact that they can't feed their families. They want to run public services down. And they think having a large gap in pay between the public and private sectors is the way to go. Encourage nurses, teachers, firefighters, paramedics and so on to go and get a job in the private sector, worsening the shortages of key workers in our public services and letting the Tories claim that the public sector model is failing. Funny how it didn't fail under Labour, isn't it? And that privatisation is the answer. You know, just like privatisation was so brilliant for our water, energy, rail and Royal Mail. As I've said before, yes, the government do some things which are stupid. But quite a lot of it just seems stupid. It's actually strategic. It all fits together. It's deliberate. They have a goal, which is served by what would be apparent stupidity. The name of the game is forcing people to think that being a public sector worker is little better than being a slave, that you won't be able to feed your family. You will suffer privations in winter. And in this regard, even the labour shortages could be considered a deliberate part of the plan. Make it as easy as possible to get jobs in the private sector. Leave our public services in ruins. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.